A narrative of resilience is etched in the island's history, a point where the echoes of dissent were met with the heavy hand of silence. The human spirit, resilient as the spice-laden breeze that sweeps across the island, faced a government wielding the power to silence dissent. Behind the vibrant facade, voices were hushed, and the courageous were incarcerated for daring to challenge the status quo.
Very substantial number of people in our country had decided that the time had come to fight back, that there was no more point in running.
Welcome to episode 9 of Resilience of the Spice Isle. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I'm pleased that you have joined us. In the 8th episode, our guest discussed many of the social and economic changes that were brought about by the revolution, which came into being on March the 13th, 1979. We also share the responses or reaction of the population to the revolution and the many calls for general elections to be held to solidify the government. In this episode, we shall discuss the silencing of dissenting voices, how this exercise was carried out between 1979 and 1983, but not before we call attention to the political system, the functioning of the government, and the idea of giving voice to the people.
The Constitution is suspended. What came into effect was called people's laws. So, for example, I'm just saying People's Law number 46, for example, would say, okay, as of this date, there's now a maternity leave law for Grenada that says A, B, C, D. Law number 105 says there is now a trade union law that says that's how it worked, basically. That's how they were written. The traditional cabinet would have been thrown out, of course, because the Constitution is suspended, and the decisions of government would have been made by the Central Committee with the Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, and other ministers of government. So you had ministers of government, whether it was education, health, housing, they were ministers of government, and they made up the Central Committee. There was also an organizing committee and a political bureau that basically would have been the sort of sub-bodies of the Central Committee, but it's the Central Committee making the decisions. As I said, there was no election.
Under the revolution, 1979 to 1983, what we find happening was there was a lot of what we call organizations in order to bring popular democracy, socialist democracy.
One of the argument for election was that every 5 years you just came up with an election and a couple of people ran and a couple of people won, and there's no accountability between the period. So one of their ideas was what they called grassroots democracy. So parish councils, zonal councils.
And the zonal councils were those councils based on mainly parishes or zones where people would form themselves and they would then interact with the leadership of the revolution. So on any one night, there would be a meeting and people would discuss the issues, etc. On the other hand, you had the NYO, National Youth Organizations. So the whole country was then organized to have the NYO. So youths, they had youth wing, youth arms throughout. And then you had the NWO, National Women's Organization. And the National Women Organization was to, again, an next grouping to form women into groupings in order to express and to bring forward issues affecting women.
During the lead up to the revolution, women have become increasingly active, and this includes women of all strata. Within the party, within NJM, there has been the formation over the past few months of a National Women's Organization. And this has groups in various parts of the country.
The Grenada Revolution created an environment where women became very empowered. They were saying poems, they were doing plays, they were in the army, they were involved in political work. So you found a sort of activism. And today when we look at the NGO community, some of the groups that were formed back then, we still see them in existence today. So women were impacted positively. The legislation was passed. For example, the maternity leave legislation. That became very important for women.
Issues that related to the running of government, issues that related to the people, and I'm going to use the budget as an example. These would have been discussed at the parish council level, at the zonal council level, with members of the National Women's Organization, Youth Organization. And their thoughts and their ideas feeds into a committee that now takes that to the government itself. So the budget was made by the Ministry of Finance. The information would have been shared to all bodies. And we had an area, like an auditorium called the Dome back in the day. And there were at least 1,000 delegates going to the Dome to have this discussion on the budget, yep, and to hear their views. And these are now representatives from the entire island, because you're either represented through your parish council, through your zonal council, as a member of the National Women, National Youth. They would have gone, they would have deliberated, and thoughts, ideas coming from the people are now sent back to the Ministry of Finance, and then a final budget comes out of it. So their thought was that this was more interactive. It was more of a way to get people involved in the actual process. Yep. So that was one of the things that was used. There was NTS, National Transportation Service, and the decision for all the conductors to be female came from a parish council. Yep. The thought was that it was a way to provide employment. So all conductors on those buses were all female. And that was one of the things that came out of a parish council discussion as to how we go about doing this whole process. Yep. So that was one of the ways that they used to actually run the government.
The justification was that we had the voices of the people to listen to on a regular basis, rather than once in every 5 years you have a voice. So that was it. And part of all this organization was, again, to learn the theories of socialism. And under the socialism, how you can then express your views, but being in tune with what we consider to be socialist ideology. So that was what they call the popular democracy that was being purported by the revolution.
And in these organizations, people were organized. They were organized around issues that mattered to them. So you had farmers' organizations. And what you found was that once people are organized around issues that are important to their lives, you have, I think, greater cohesiveness in the society, because you build greater social capital. You build greater networks around issues that matter. And you're not just, creating a society based on party political affiliation. So women and children were affected in terms of legislation that was passed, in terms of the organizing and the mobilizing, in terms of groups and so forth and so on.
Now, what that did, it really did allow for a lot of popular support and a lot of more voices being heard. But on the other hand, people that express opposition to those viewpoints was readily ostracized. So as much as you had these popular groups being formed and lots of people able to go and express views, those that had or questioned the direction were easily labeled as counter-revolutionaries. So I did mention some names to you earlier on. For example, the revolution was in 1979. So by April, you find that the guy that led the attack and that led the attack on the St. Patrick police station was part of the revolution. By that time, he was arrested and put in prison. So within 6 months, he was arrested. Within 6 months, the guy that was the founder of the New Jewel movement that came together to form the NGM with MAP, he too was in prison along with a series of other guys. It's a classic case of undermining the leader, in that those persons that was very close to Maurice Bishop at that time, those persons that were able to offer support to Maurice was then ostracized, then vilified, and put in prison. The trend is the big supporters of Maurice Bishop, most of them that stood up and fought the revolution, was being replaced by a new cadre of leaders in the revolution. The new cadres were the new guys that were mainly part of the oral grouping that was formed way before March 13, 1979. The generals, so they formed the influential bodies. So if you fast track to 1983, 17 Grenadians were jailed for the execution of Maurice Bishop. One of them came from the Alta parish. The 16 of the others were mainly part of that grouping. The 16 of them were almost handpicked and given the generals, the captains, the this in the army. So there was a trend of ostracizing and eliminating the support around and under Maurice Bishop. So again, as I said, yes, immediately after the revolution, you was embraced, but soon after you start having fallout. Now, let me say, I hope I'm not coming out that everything was really bad. Everything was not bad. Even today, there are some people that have this serious love affair with the revolution, because there was a psychological a connection that people believe that some people still believe that the revolution is our salvation, was the salvation, because the revolution did plow into our psyche as we resisted. We challenged the mighty US. We challenged the imperialist forces. We were prepared to fight and die to save Grenada at that time. So yes, all that and more. Not only that, the whole idea of grow what you eat and, eat what you grow and grow what you eat was some of the slogans. The slogans of the revolution captivated the minds of Grenadians and galvanized a large number of Grenadians to want to be and want to act for and on behalf of the revolution. That ideology, that propaganda, that information was so powerful that some people were willing to turn their back even on their parents in support of the revolution, because the revolution was all encompassing, it was all good for a large number of Grenadians. So that is what the revolution had meant to some people. That is what the revolution still means to some people. You find, of course, on the military side, you find the army. So you had the People Revolutionary Army. Then you had the militia, which was, the militia was this group of volunteers. So the militia was a group of volunteers that were training militarily, but they were not part of the formal army. So every other village had a militia group that was involved in, doing training, and the main weapon then was, what we had was very close to the, what we call the 303 at that time. It was the M52. Actually, that was the first set of weapons that reached Grenada. It was the M52. That what was being used mainly as a weapon of choice for the militias. And then lower down we had primary school and others being formed what you call a pioneer group. So they was training, but they was marching and doing stuff, but they had no weapons. They were not training, by and large. But the militias, voluntary group, had weapons. They were training with rifles and etc. And they used to, some of them were involved in training together with the army, the official army.
There would have been a police force when the PRG took over. What the PRG introduced was an army, so the People's Revolutionary Army. So these were soldiers, like any other soldier, and they introduced something called the militia. So the militia was voluntary, where you would do voluntary military training, whether male, female, it didn't matter. What's very interesting is that you had quite a few women involved in that whole military, the militia. We have an iconic picture of a young woman in her high school uniform with her AK-47 strapped across her. She would have joined the army. She actually would have fought in 1983 when the US would have invaded. She was a student and a soldier as well. But the militia was a voluntary one. So if you wanted to, you could have joined the militia.
But I remember during that period from 79 to 83, from 79 I started working. I left school in 80, so I started working immediately after. And during that time in the ministries, there was what you call ministerial, they had little pockets of army-like things. So they used to come to, I forget what I used to call it, but they used to come to teach people. I remember they had this group of us that we were learning to use the 303, the big gun, and we used to go to the pasture and have shootouts and stuff. Then we were taught how to scrap and unscrap and pick them. So those little things, and it was so exciting. I mean, you didn't see anything dangerous in that. All you know is it was the excitement, and you wanted to be in it, and you wanted to be part of it. And when I remember when the truck come for us, and then time to go to they said we were going in this field they call Gilvis pasture. That's somewhere up in Tempe, and they said we were going up there to shooting range. So I remember that time. I mean, excitement, young people. Remember, we had to, they set up some little tins and way in the distance, and you had to line up and showing you how to squeeze your eye to shoot. Oh, that was some exciting days. They used to call it the militia, the ministry militia.
One of the drawbacks of the revolution that persons would have complained about was the access to guns. Access in the sense that you had young people at 15-year-olds who could have scrapped the AK-47 and put it back together again.
As a teenager, I would look to see, with guns. And I thought that was a negative aspect of it, where children were too much involved in the military. They were young and very much exposed.
And for some people, that was very scary. Yeah? Very troubling that you had that sort of access. But you did have situations like that. Yep, definitely.
Now, to place the widespread silencing of dissenting voices in perspective, Dr. Philip Dow compares it to the pre-revolutionary period.
Just before Gary is ousted from office, he would have passed an act that ensured that newspapers, you had to pay some ridiculous amount of money to register your newspaper, for example. And it was passed into law. So it's restricting the press. And one of those, the idea was to sort of shut down the Jewel at the time. Another thing that he would have done was to make restrictions for trade unions so that you don't get to strike and to demonstrate. What you found happening is, and of course we spoke of Gary's victimization and violence. When the PRG gets into power, they did the same thing. So they shut down the Torchlight newspaper.
There is one man in the Caribbean who is a shareholder and a director of the Trinidad Express, the Trinidad Sun, the Grenada Torchlight, the Barbados Nation, the Barbados Sunday Sun, Barbados Radio Rediffusion, and the chairman of the board of Bright Takana, putting out all that garbage in all the islands, in every radio station and newspaper. One man. So when you think you're hearing a lot of different people talking, is one man you hear talking. And that man wrote an editorial in the Express a few weeks ago in which he openly called for the violent overthrow of the Grenada government. In relation to Torchlight, We were saying we were even willing to accept malicious and lying and destructive criticism that was not based on facts. The kind of criticism that was taking rubbish and garbage out of overseas newspapers, where they were talking about how we cut down forests and we have missiles aimed at other islands, where they were talking about Russian naval bases in Carriacou. Even that kind of destructive criticism we were willing to put up with, because we felt the revolution was strong enough. But the one thing we can put up with from nobody is when they move to a stage to actively begin to incite violence, to actively begin to make counter-revolution. And that is why, following the Rastas article on the Wednesday Torchlight, we have to move on the Torchlight right away. They're even inviting the Rastas to go out and demonstrate for their rights. Can you imagine that? Torchlight newspaper.
After shutting it down, the Grenadian Voice came up and they shut that down too. They imprisoned the editor of the newspaper. So as far as they were concerned, their idea of this was they did not want any destabilizing voices against the revolution. And one of the arguments with the Torchlight was that it was destabilizing and had all sorts of negative things about the revolution, and they did not want to promote this. Of course, you're interfering with the freedom of the press, so that obviously does not work.
The revolution did not tolerate any other voices. As a matter of fact, the Catholic Focus, which was a paper published by the Catholic Church, that was shut down before even the Grenadian Voice. And they didn't resist. That's why I find strange the community, the civil society, they all just cooperated. They didn't, or the fear of being detained. You know, no one wanted to take a stand. And that was a danger in itself, because it is my belief, if they stood up, things would have been better, or history could have been different. But they were not willing to take a stand. And as a result, there was only one voice, the voice of the revolution.
So if you were not for the revolution, if they disagreed with you for whatever reason, you found yourself in jail without trial. And it would have been persons who disagreed. And what's interesting, it's sometimes people who would have been with them in the initial parts of it. So there were at least two, there would have been more, who would have been part of the National Liberation Army, who would have actually done the takeover. And eventually they would have fallen out along the way. So they ended up in jail. Yep. As I mentioned, the editor of the newspaper, he ended up in jail. We have a former prime minister who ended up in jail because they were not willing to listen to any dissenting voices at all, right? So they made basically the same mistakes that Gary did in those instances.
If we were to compare notes, at no time Gary had more than 20 persons in prison as political prisoners. The revolution in 4.5 years had over 3,000 Grenadians detained. It is not for me to say, the records are there. Over 3,000 Grenadians were detained on all sort of frivolous charges, including Tillman Thomas, yes, including Tillman Thomas, and including a large number of supporters, people that fought for the revolution.
I took a stand to defend institutions and human rights. And as a matter of fact, I was associated with an organization which Bishop and them was involved in. They called Caribbean Human Rights and Legal Aid Company. I started working there for a short while. But as the revolution started taking root in the country, it seemed that there was not much concern about human rights. And I became a little critical. And by 1981, Les Pierre, the late Les Pierre, who was a journalist, and others decided to establish a newspaper known as the Grenadian Voice. by that time the revolution had passed a law stating that no one person would set up a company and establish a newspaper. You need a minimum of 26. So they got 26 of us, formed this company. After the second publication, Lloyd Noel, Leslie P. and myself, we were detained in 1981 after the second publication of the Grenadian Voice.
As you are aware, Tillman Thomas eventually became Prime Minister of Grenada during the period 2008 to 2013. Let us step back to the period of which he speaks and learn of the details or the events of that early Saturday morning when he was forcefully removed from his home to begin his period of imprisonment.
Yeah, I was at my home in St. Patrick's in Hermitage. Saturday morning about 5 o'clock, soldiers knock on my door and they said they want to take me for questioning. And they want me to come along with them. And I cooperated, I went along with them. They took me to a fort in St. Patrick's, then the fort in St. George's for about 3 months, and then to Richmond Hill Prison. They restrict you, you're confined to your cell. You had access, you could read and exercise in your cell. You had during the day, you had about an hour or 2 hours exercise, outside. But generally, for most of the time, you're being locked up in a cell. You have visitation rights, yes, and then once or twice a month. At times they restrict it, but you have visitation rights. You bring your family and friends, bring fruits and other things for you. But I ended up spending about 2 years and 3 months in detention. All those who were detained during that period, they were never tried. We got off really on the intervention in October, 26. But after the revolution now, the bishop in control as prime minister, there were still problems, those who were championing human rights, people saw them too as also violating rights because with the suspension of the Constitution, they didn't recognize your right to associate, your right to assemble, and your right to form organization. And people were detained without trial. And this is where some of us are really concerned about what direction the country was heading. As a matter of fact, this is the time when I got involved to a certain extent, because prior to the revolution, I supported the forces that were critical of Gary to bring about, respect for institutions, better governance, and respect for the rights of the citizen. So when people started to complain and people were being detained without trial, well, I raised the issue myself as being an attorney. I qualified in 78. I became an attorney in 1978. I graduated from the law school in 78 and came back to Grenada.
In the face of adversity, the people found strength in unity. The prison bars could not confine their spirits. It only fueled that fire of resilience. Interestingly enough, as you will learn in another episode, in 2009, Tillman Thomas, in his capacity as Prime Minister of Grenada, bestowed a major honor on the man whose regime imprisoned him. Truly, a fine example of the resilience of the Spice Isle. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. The series continues next week at the same time.